Welcome back to a space for untold historical stories rarely shown on film. Sometimes we step into a museum and gaze at gigantic war machines with glossy paint and cannon barrels raised proudly, and we are easily deceived by their outward grandeur. But today, I want to invite you to go deeper than that. I'm not inviting you to look at technical specifications. I'm inviting you to step inside the souls of the people who lived and died inside those steel monsters. And to guide this journey, we won't follow in the footsteps of a general or a historian. We will follow the memories of a silent witness, an old silver pocket watch with a shattered crystal and a second hand that stopped in 1945. This watch is now lying beneath the dim yellow light of a display case at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Visitors look at it as a scrap of debris from the past, but for those who once stood inside a steel belly, it was the only measure of life. In the world of tanks, time isn't counted by hours or minutes the way we do while sitting in an office or a cafe. Their time is counted by each frantic heartbeat as the engine's roar begins to shake the floor. It is counted by the suffocating silence between two artillery barrages, where the breath of 5 men blends into a heavy air thick with kerosene and primal fear. This silver watch has passed through places even sunlight could not reach. It has rested in the jacket pockets of boys not yet 20 for whom the tank's cramped hull became a living room, a workplace, and sometimes a shared grave. What is the truth that Hollywood films often hide? It is not spectacular chases across vast plains, but the crushing claustrophobia that squeezes every inch of your lungs. When the hatch on top of the turret slams shut, you no longer belong to the free world outside. You become part of the machine. The watch sensed that more clearly than anyone. It felt the rising heat as the engine block behind began to radiate like the breath of a mechanical dragon. It felt the vibration as tracks weighing dozens of tons ground the gravel beneath, creating a symphony of destruction whose brutality only those inside could truly understand. 5 men trapped in a metal box barely a few square meters wide, where a small elbow movement could break a comrade's bones, where the stench of sweat mixed with gunpowder to form a kind of spiritual poison that could make anyone collapse, before the enemy's first round ever struck the armor. This watch once belonged to a young man named Hans, a loader on a Panzer IV. But it also lay in the hands of a Sherman driver named Joe, and it ultimately ended its journey on the table of a legendary Tiger commander. Through its broken crystal, we will see that on any side, the pain and suffocation are the same. It was a mobile form of torture that history calls glory. Over the next 30 minutes, I want you to close your eyes, listen to the sound of metal expanding, smell the pungent engine oil in your mind, and feel the pulse of this silver watch as it leads us down into the bellies of 3 legendary monsters, to understand why out of 10 crews as many as 8 never made it back to read the time again. The silver watch sat snug in the pocket of Hans's black jacket, a 19-year-old with hands hardened by calluses and grease. Hans was the loader on a Panzer IV, the backbone of Germany's armored forces. As Hans climbed through the hatch, the watch felt the sudden change in the air. The outside world, with Poland's blue sky, vanished, replaced by a gray stale space reeking of metal and fuel. This was the place Hans and 4 other comrades would call home through the long months of marching. Pressed to Hans's chest, the watch heard his heart beating fast and hard, a rhythm that clashed with the cold indifference of the steel around him. In the belly of this Panzer IV, everything was designed to serve war, not human beings. Hans sat low in the turret, surrounded by racks of gleaming 75mm shells, bright and deadly. The silver watch rattled violently with each rotation of the Maybach HL120 engine behind his back. Its roar was not a distant sound, but a living presence, a continuous vibration that ran from the steel floor straight into the soldier's bones. As the tank began to move, the watch felt the brutal jolts. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, every meter of rough ground became a physical trial. Hans's knees slammed into the sharp edges of ammunition bins. His elbow constantly scraped against electrical cables tangled like spider webs. Space was so precious here that even a deep breath felt like trespassing into the next man's territory. Time began to flow in a strange way. The watch still ticked steadily, but Hans seemed to forget the concept of day and night. The only light that slipped inside came through narrow vision slits in the commander's periscopes, making the outside world look like broken, distant fragments. When the battle began, the watch sensed extreme tension. The commander's shouts cracked through the static-filled intercom. Load, Hans had to twist his body in a space too tight to fully extend his arms, lifting heavy shells and feeding them into the breach. Each time the main gun spat fire, a blast of scorching air and the pungent reek of propellant flooded the compartment. The silver watch warmed with Hans's body heat as he sweated through his clothes even while snow fell outside. The gun smoke had nowhere to go. It clung to lungs, uniforms, and even the watch's cracked crystal, forming a hazy film of destruction. The torture did not come only from enemy fire, but from the stripping away of the most basic human needs. The watch saw Hans eat dry scraps of bread with hands blackened by oil and drink warm gulps of water tainted with metal from an old fuel can. There was no privacy, no hygiene. The stench of 5 men unwashed for weeks. The vomit of those who couldn't endure the shaking and the thickened odor of fear fused into a haunting scent. The silver watch would carry forever. The Panzer IV may have been a marvel of engineering, but for those inside, it was a mobile oven, where sanity was worn down by the eternal grind of iron tracks crushing stone. Hans looked at the watch, not to see when the battle would end, but to wonder whether he would live long enough to see the hands complete one more full turn. The fighting on the Eastern Front was a white nightmare. When a Red Army anti-tank round struck the track, the Panzer IV jerked to a halt like a wounded beast. Steel slammed against steel like thunder, right beside the eardrum. In the chaos of smoke and flame, Hans scrambled to escape through the side hatch. The silver watch, already loosened by repeated impacts, slipped from his pocket and fell onto the grease-slick steel floor. It lay there in the darkness of a defeated machine. Amid the groans of cooling metal, Hans got out, but he left a piece of his memory behind in the belly of the German monster. The watch lay there waiting for another hand, another faction to continue the story of human endurance inside steel. The silver watch lay motionless on the steel floor of the abandoned Panzer IV, its crystal coated with a gray film of gunpowder dust and cold engine oil. Time seemed frozen inside that dark compartment until a harsh metallic scrape rang out. A large hand wearing a thick leather glove of the Allied Army reached into the wreckage. It was Joe, a tank driver from the U.S. 2nd Armored Division. He was rummaging through the German hulk for souvenirs or usable parts. When Joe's fingers touched the cold silver casing, he brushed away the dust, saw the faded photograph inside the watch's cover, and slipped it into his own pocket. The watch had just endured a brutal migration from the defeated to the victor, but it soon realized that inside a steel monster, victory and defeat carry the same price. Joe carried the watch into his kingdom, an M4 Sherman. The moment he climbed through the front hull hatch, the watch felt a completely different atmosphere, yet no less suffocating. If the Panzer IV felt like a rough, disciplined machine, the Sherman felt like a mobile industrial factory. Joe hung the silver watch on a small hook beside the control panel, just above the levers and pressure gauges. From this spot, our silent witness began to observe a new crew. They no longer wore the black uniforms of German tankers, but olive drab protective gear, yet their eyes were no different from Hans's. They were the eyes of men imprisoned inside a tall steel cube, a moving target they spoke of with both affection and dread. Bronson, the lighter that advertisements promised, would light on the first strike. The inside of the Sherman seemed taller than the Panzer IV, but the confinement still haunted every corner. Joe sat, front left, his legs jammed between pedals and a massive transmission that radiated heat. The silver watch trembled to a different rhythm, faster, more anxious as the American Continental engine roared. In this compartment, the smell of gasoline was stronger than ever. It was a threatening smell, reminding the crew they were sitting on hundreds of liters of flammable fuel and dozens of shells ready to explode. The watch observed Joe each time he glanced at the family photograph inside the watch's cover, a ritual repeated like a prayer before every march. These American soldiers joked more. They chewed gum and listened to music through a crackling radio. Yet, the silver watch felt the tremor in Joe's hands each time the Sherman pushed through the towering hedgerows of Normandy, where every bush could conceal an enemy anti-tank gun. The truth of the M4 Sherman began to reveal itself through the long, grinding journeys. The watch felt the French summer heat baking the steel, turning the compartment into a true boiler. Joe and his comrades sweated constantly, their uniforms sticking to their skin, reeking of exhaustion and chronic sleeplessness. Each time the tank was struck by shrapnel, the sound was like a colossal bell being hammered, shocking every cell in the bodies inside. The silver watch hanging above the panel swung violently, as if warning of an approaching collapse. For Joe, this tank was the only shield against sniper fire, and yet it was also a deadly trap ready to erupt in flames from the smallest spark. The watch's migration was not only a change of owners, it was the transfer of pain. It saw Joe share melting pieces of chocolate with the assistant driver in a space too tight for them to even turn and face each other. It heard shouted directions over the static-filled intercom as the Sherman tried to squeeze through narrow village roads. And then, on a fateful afternoon, at an unnamed crossroads, an explosion tore the silence apart. The silver watch was flung from its hook as an 88mm shell punched through the Sherman's thin side armor. Fire began to surge from the engine compartment. The smell of burning gasoline and oil formed a thick black cloud. Joe fought to force the hatch open, and in that life-or-death instant, he accidentally knocked the watch down into a gap between the floor and the ammunition stowage. The Sherman burned true to its nickname, and the silver watch was left behind once more lying in the ashes of an American industrial symbol, waiting to be claimed by the last king of the battlefield. The silver watch now lay in the pocket of Joe, a tank driver from the U.S. 2nd Armored Division. After being picked up from the wreckage of the Eastern Front, it undertook a transcontinental journey. That journey ended when the watch was imprisoned, inside the belly of a completely different steel monster, the M4 Sherman. As Joe climbed through the front hatch and lowered himself onto the narrow leather seat, the watch sensed America's industrial atmosphere. The Sherman did not have the same rough, grease-heavy stench as the Panzer IV, but it carried another smell, far more frightening, the overpowering odor of gasoline filling the compartment. Joe hung the silver watch on a small hook beside the control panel, next to a family photograph yellowed by time. From there, the silent witness began to observe life inside the steel box the Germans often called Ronson, a lighter whose advertisements claimed it lit with a single strike. Inside the Sherman's driving compartment, the space seemed a bit higher and brighter, thanks to modern periscope designs. Even so, confinement still clung like a ghost to every movement. Joe sat at the controls, his legs wedged tight between the drive pedals, and a massive transmission radiating heat in the center of the hull. The silver watch vibrated to the rhythm of the roaring Continental engine. It was a steady, mechanical sound, yet always carrying an undertone of instability. Joe and his crew tried to stay upbeat, chewing gum and joking over the static-filled intercom. But the watch sensed the truth behind those smiles, the tension of knowing their armor was not thick enough to stop German 88mm rounds. Each time the tank crossed the towering hedgerows of Normandy, Joe tightened his grip on the steering levers. The silver watch recorded his racing heartbeat whenever an explosion sounded somewhere across the fields. The torture inside the Sherman was colored by heat and constant anxiety. In the summer of 1944, the steel hull absorbed sunlight and turned the compartment into a boiler. Joe and his comrades sweated through their clothes. Their uniforms clung to their skin, stinking of fatigue and long-term sleeplessness. The silver watch watched Joe drink warm metal-tainted water. He ate cold canned rations right at the driver's position. There was no time to rest, no room to stretch. They lived and fought in a space no larger than a small wardrobe. Their greatest fear was not instant death, but fire. The watch felt the jolt each time a round grazed the armor, throwing eerie sparks inside a compartment filled with fuel vapor and ammunition. The M4 Sherman was a symbol of mass production, but for the 5 men inside, it was a high-risk mobile prison. The silver watch observed Joe whenever he checked the time for coordinated fire missions. He wasn't looking at numbers, he was looking at the family photograph in the watch's cover. It was his last tether to the peaceful world beyond the battlefield. The brutal truth was that inside this steel monster life was incredibly fragile. If a round pierced the armor and reached the ammunition stowage, the Sherman would burn like a torch. The watch witnessed that horrifying moment in an ambush at a village crossroads. An explosion ripped open the silence. Flames licked at electrical cables and spilled engine oil. In the chaos of black smoke and rising heat, Joe struggled to force the hatch open. The silver watch was flung from its hook and fell onto the burning floor. It lay there once again, witnessing the collapse of a steel hope, and it kept waiting amid the ashes to be claimed by the next fate. The silver watch now lay in the pocket of Joe, a tank driver from the U.S. 2nd Armored Division. After being picked up from the wreckage of the Eastern Front, it undertook a transcontinental journey and was ultimately locked inside the belly of a completely different steel monster, the M4 Sherman. When Joe climbed through the front hatch and sat down on the narrow leather seat, the watch sensed an atmosphere steeped in America's industrial breath. The Sherman lacked the rough, heavy grease stench of the Panzer IV, but it carried another odor far more frightening, the overpowering smell of gasoline. Joe hung the silver watch on a small hook right beside the control panel, next to a family photo grown yellow with age. From that position, our silent witness began to observe life inside the steel box the Germans often called Ronson, the lighter whose advertisements claimed it lit with a single strike. In the Sherman's driving compartment, the space seemed a little higher and brighter thanks to modern periscope designs, but the confinement still clung like a ghost. Joe sat at the controls, his legs wedged tight between the drive pedals and the huge heat-radiating transmission in the center of the hull. The silver watch vibrated to the rhythm of the Continental engine, a steady mechanical sound that always hinted at instability. Joe and his crew tried to stay optimistic, chewing gum and joking over the intercom, but the watch sensed the truth behind their smiles. It was the extreme tension of knowing their armor was not thick enough to stop German 88mm shells. Each time the tank crossed Normandy's towering hedgerows, Joe tightened his grip on the steering levers, and the silver watch recorded his racing heartbeat whenever an explosion sounded somewhere out across the fields. The torture inside the Sherman was shaped by heat and anxiety. In the summer of 1944, the tank's steel hull absorbed sunlight and turned the compartment into a true boiler. Joe and his comrades sweated constantly, their uniforms stuck to their skins, stinking of exhaustion and chronic sleeplessness. The silver watch saw Joe drink warm gulps of metal-tainted water and eat cold canned rations right at the driver's seat. There was no time to rest, no room to stretch. They lived, fought, and sometimes died, in a space no larger than a small wardrobe. Their greatest fear was not a sudden death, but fire. The watch felt the jolt whenever an enemy round grazed the armor, throwing eerie sparks inside a compartment filled with gasoline fumes and ammunition. The M4 Sherman was a symbol of mass production, but for the 5 men inside it was a high-risk mobile prison. The silver watch observed Joe whenever he checked it to time-coordinated barrages. He wasn't looking at the numbers. He was looking at the family photograph in the watch's cover as his last tether to the peaceful world outside. The brutal truth was that inside this steel monster, life is fragile. Once an enemy round pierced the armor and struck the dry ammunition stowage, the Sherman would burn like a torch. The watch witnessed that horrifying moment in an ambush at a village crossroads. An explosion tore the silence apart. Flames began to lick at electrical cables and engine oil. In the chaos of black smoke and surging heat, Joe fought to force the hatch open. The silver watch was flung from its hook, falling to the floor as flames began to swallow everything. It lay there once again, witnessing the collapse of a steel hope waiting to be rescued from the ashes of the Allied king. The silver watch still hung from the small iron hook beside Joe's control panel, its crystal reflecting faint rays of light slipping through the Sherman's viewing slit. It was a sweltering afternoon at an unnamed crossroads in Normandy, where the scent of dried grass mixed with the overpowering gasoline fumes rising from the engine compartment behind. Joe was intensely focused, both hands clenched on the steering levers, sweat streaming down his forehead. The watch felt Joe's heartbeat pounding hard, a rhythm of anxiety as if he sensed something terrible was about to happen. In this cramped, suffocating space, 5 men held their breath. They listened to the tracks crushing broken brick and to the buzzing static of the intercom. They did not know that hidden behind the shattered wall ahead, a German 88mm gun barrel was aimed straight at the thin side armor of this Allied monster. The moment steel began to melt started with an ear-splitting blast so violent that the silver watch was thrown from its hook. It hit the grease-slick steel floor as the enemy's armor-piercing round sliced cleanly through the plate, carrying tremendous heat. Red-hot fragments of spalled steel sprayed through the compartment. Instantly, the watch felt a horrifying shift in temperature. The Sherman symbol of American industrial power began to burn true to its nickname, Bronson. The fire started at the dry ammunition stowage, where propellant bags met extreme heat and detonated. The silver watch lay beneath the floor line, its crystal beginning to crack further, under the pressure of small internal blasts. The stench of burning gasoline and molten plastic from the electrical cables formed a dense black smoke. The smoke swallowed every gap and strangled the crew's breath. The real torture was not the first impact, but the life and death seconds that followed as steel began to deform. The watch witnessed horrifying chaos in the thick black smoke. Joe screamed, trying to force the hatch above him, but it was jammed by blast pressure. The temperature inside surged into the hundreds of degrees. In an instant, the compartment became a literal oven. The silver watch lay against the floor, feeling the searing heat warp the delicate components inside its mechanism. The men inside were no longer heroic warriors. They were human beings desperately struggling against the most fiery death a tanker could imagine. Their screams were drowned out by the roar of flames devouring fuel and ammunition. In this moment, every military theory and every idea of battlefield glory became meaningless before raw survival instinct. In the final seconds before the Sherman became a massive fireball, Joe gathered his last strength to kick the hatch open and escape. In panic and pain, his boot accidentally struck the silver watch, pushing it deeper into a narrow gap between the floor and an empty ammunition compartment. The silver watch lay there, its crystal shattered, its second hand forever stopped at the exact moment steel began to deform. Under extreme heat, it became part of the wreckage, a silent witness to the moment life was burned away inside steel. The Sherman had fallen, and the silver watch had as well. It carried chemical scorch marks and the haunting memory of a death in fire. It lay motionless inside the charred hull, waiting to be collected by another predator from the ashes of defeat. The flames on the Sherman finally died down, leaving a blackened steel carcass reeking of burned metal in a devastated Normandy field. Amid shattered glass and ash, a tall figure in the dark gray uniform of Germany's armored forces approached. It was Captain Kurt, commander of a Tiger I that had just destroyed Joe's unit in a bloody ambush. As Kurt nudged aside the debris with the tip of his boot, the weak sunset light reflected off the silver casing of the watch, lodged between the floor seams. He bent down to pick it up using a handkerchief to wipe away the black soot clinging to the cracked crystal. Kurt did not know Hans or Joe. He only saw a finely made object battered by war and slipped it into his breast pocket. There, the silver watch began to feel the steady, yet pressured heartbeat of a man commanding a king. When Kurt stepped inside the Tiger, the watch sensed an entirely different scale and presence. This was not the cramped Panzer IV or the sweltering Sherman. The Tiger I was a true fortress, with armor so thick that the whistle of wind and the chatter of machine guns outside were muted, replaced by a heavy, solemn silence. Kurt set the watch on the small map table beside the commander's position in the turret. Here, our silent witness began to observe the Tiger's crew, the most seasoned soldiers of all. But the silver watch recognized a harsh truth: the thicker the armor, the greater the fear. Because when you are the strongest and most feared on the battlefield, every enemy gun from every direction has only one target: you. Inside the Tiger's belly, the silver watch felt an invisible yet crushing pressure. The powerful Maybach engine roared like a beast imprisoned beneath the floor, sending low vibrations that numbed the crew's feet through hours of marching. The smell inside the Tiger was not the flammable gasoline stink of the Sherman, but a dense engine oil scent mixed with the gunpowder of the enormous 88mm cannon. The watch saw the loader struggle with shells weighing nearly 15 kilograms. Even with more room, the interior was still filled with sharp edges ready to crush finger bones in a single careless second. Each time the main gun fired, the entire 56-ton mass shuddered like a small earthquake. The blast was sharp and powerful enough that the silver watch seemed ready to crack another line into its own crystal. The truth of the Tiger I became clearer as the war neared its end and Germany's resources ran dry. The watch saw extreme exhaustion etched on the faces of Kurt and his crew. The Tiger was powerful, but it was a clumsy giant in mud and often plagued by mechanical failures. The watch felt their tension spike each time a track jammed or the drivetrain groaned under overload. The crew no longer joked or chewed gum like the Americans. They worked in a frightening silence, broken only by Kurt's brief, razor-edged commands over the radio. They knew they were the #1 target of Allied bombers and swarms of tanks. One small navigational mistake, and the king would become an immovable steel coffin. In the final days at the front, Kurt's Tiger was surrounded by overwhelming numbers. The silver watch felt earth-shaking impacts from shells that could not penetrate the frontal armor yet created lethal spall fragments inside the compartment. Those fragments threatened the crew's lives directly. Kurt kept his steel calm, but dark circles cut deep beneath his eyes from sleeplessness and silent despair. The silver watch witnessed the final moment when the Tiger ran out of fuel and threw a track on a muddy road during the retreat. There were no recovery vehicles, no reinforcements. Kurt looked at the watch one last time, exhaled, and ordered the crew to set incendiary charges to destroy the tank before withdrawing on foot. In frantic haste with enemy artillery drawing closer, the silver watch was left behind once more on the map table. It lay there looking through the open hatch slit as the last soldiers disappeared, leaving it alone in the cold dark of a dead king. The silver watch remained on the map table of the Tiger I as the steel monster cooled by the roadside. It was no longer shaken by thunderous explosions, no longer baked by heat pouring from the massive engine, and it no longer heard any soldier's racing heartbeat. It lay alone amid a steel graveyard of a collapsing empire until the war ended and battlefield cleanup teams from the victors found it. After decades of drifting through secondhand shops and private collections, it finally came to rest in a military museum display case carrying scratches from the fields of Poland, cracks in its crystal from Normandy, and the smoke-stained odor of despair that could never be washed away. Today's visitors look at it and see a finely crafted exhibit, an artifact from a bygone age. But the watch knows its true value lies in what the eye cannot see, the wordless scars clinging to the souls of Hans, Joe, and Kurt. Tank crewmen, lucky enough to survive and return home, often carried unwanted gifts from the bellies of steel monsters, permanent ringing in their ears that meant they would never hear absolute silence again. Lungs chronically damaged from inhaling too much lead, smoke, gasoline, vapor, and metallic dust. Yet heavier than all of it was the ghost of confinement that haunted their sleep. Some veterans, after decades of peace, still could not endure the feeling of sitting in a room with the doors closed, or jolted awake in the middle of the night, convinced the smell of engine oil in their garage was the scent of a tank fire about to erupt. They escaped the bellies of the Panzer, the Sherman, or the Tiger in body, but part of their souls seemed forever imprisoned in those cramped metal boxes. The Silver Watch understands that the glory people praise in heroic films is only a glossy coat of paint over a harsh reality. War does not create true kings of the battlefield. It creates only human beings who survived by luck, carrying memories that time can never erase. The message I want to send you today is not to praise the power of cannons or the supposedly impenetrable thickness of armor. It is about the miraculous yet painful endurance of human beings when they are forced into the most inhuman living conditions. When you have a chance to see a tank in a museum or in a documentary, remember the story of the Silver Watch. Remember that inside those killing machines once lived 5 human lives, 5 families waiting in anguish, and a living space so small that fear could be touched by hand. The truth behind the steel is not in dry statistics of victory or defeat, but in the warmth and empathy of the soldiers who had to lean against one another to make it through a man-made hell. Thank you for giving your precious time to walk with me and this Silver Watch on our descent into the depths of 3 legendary monsters. If you feel this story has given you a fresher, more humane, and deeper perspective on humanity's darkest pages, please don't hesitate to like and share this video with others who share the same passion for history. Your support and your comments sharing what you felt are my greatest source of motivation, so I can continue researching and uncovering the lesser-known truths behind these great war machines. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so we can meet again on the journeys ahead, where we will continue to analyze war through the eyes of ordinary people crushed by the wheels of history, yet still holding on to their dignity. Once again, my sincere thanks. I wish you a peaceful day, and I'll see you again in the next war stories on our channel. Goodbye.